This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. It's tax season, and we're all a bit tired of numbers. But here's one you need to hear. $16.5 billion. That's how much the IRS flagged for possible identity fraud last year. Now here's a good number. 100 million. That's how many data points LifeLock monitors every second. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it. Guaranteed. Save up to 40% your first year at LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the Film Stories podcast.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew. That's everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, well, as the title suggests, I'm here to talk of the stories of films. I tend to talk development stories, production stories, behind-the-scenes bits and bobs, marketing, release, just those little contributory factors that go towards making the films that we know and sometimes love, just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The movies I tend to choose for this podcast, if you're here for the first time, hello. If you're not, hello. The movies I tend to choose tend to have a mainstream leaning. They certainly do again this week as well. They're aligned to films that I have some interest in. I don't do snark. If you're on the if you're looking for a podcast that punches down and snarks about movies, this is not the one. I make no apology for that. Instead, what I try to do is celebrate the fact that even whether it's the best or the worst of films, still takes a monumental human effort to bring a movie to a cinema screen. Enough preamble. I'm going to crack on with the first of the two stories I'm going to talk about in this episode of the podcast, and we're going to go back to 2001. Let's do a bit of computer hacking. Here's a clip.
Now, I'm not some grungy wannabe filmmaker that's searching for existentialism through a haze of bong smoke or something. No, it's easy to pick apart bad acting, short-sighted directing, and a purely moronic stringing together of words that many of the studios term as prose. No, I'm talking about the lack of realism. Realism. Not a pervasive element in today's modern American cinematic vision.
And you have to say, that's a clip that's a little bit on the bold side. We're going back to 2001's Swordfish. What you heard there is part of John Travolta's opening monologue from the film. The movie is directed by Dominic Senna. Written solely credited to Skip Woods. The cast for this one, John Travolta, Hugh Jackman, Halle Berry, Don Cheadle, Sam Shepard and Vinnie Jones leading the ensemble of this one. And yeah, I mean, realism isn't necessarily something that's high up the agenda for Swordfish, but delightfully, director Dominic Senna did a director's commentary on the DVD, and I've dipped into that a little bit for some of the quotes that you're going to hear, where he dissects just why Swordfish wasn't realistic. And let's face it, it was not. Nonetheless, let us rewind. The script for this one had been penned by Skip Woods. He would go on to do A Good Day to Die Hard, amongst other projects. And it was a screenplay that was on the docket of producer Joel Silver. Now, Joel Silver, uber producer really in Hollywood circles, the Lethal Weapon films, etc., etc. And by the end of the 1990s, well, in 1999, he'd overseen and produced The Matrix. So as far as Warner Brothers was concerned, Joel Silver, at a point where blockbuster cinema was turning quite a lot, Joel Silver had some kind of magic touch there that The Matrix had turned into this absolute juggernaut, and he would be developing the sequels at the point that Swordfish got going as well. So Swordfish was one of the projects that he had. And separately, director Dominic Senna, well, he had a breakthrough movie of his own in the summer of 2000. You might remember this one, Nicolas Cage in the new take on Gone in 60 Seconds, notable for the film in which Vinnie Jones says very, very little whatsoever. That had proven to be a hit. It had come out in June of 2000. And at the point where he'd wrapped up on Gone in 60 Seconds, Senna was looking for another movie to do. And he talked several times about how he'd gone through 60 or 70 different scripts just trying to find something of interest. And then he happened across the screenplay that Skip Woods had penned for Swordfish. And what the appeal for him here, I mean, it's well known that Swordfish is a computer hacking film, albeit not not, as discussed, a massively realistic one. But he was attracted by the fact that here was a screenplay he read where he legitimately didn't really know which way it was going to go. He would confess that he's an outsider to the computing world, that he could put together an action sequence, that much was clear, but a lot of the technicals of this weren't really his area of expertise. He also liked the way that the film was structured, because Swordfish begins with a bank heist and then pretty much goes backwards. And so at the point where Gone in 60 Seconds was generating buzz, he read the script for Swordfish, which Skip Woods was clearly influenced by Dog Day Afternoon, the classic 70s movie that is name-checked in the film. Joel Silver also had cachet with Warner Brothers and had the power to get Swordfish going, and all this was starting to come together, that Senna was interested and would sign up to do the movie. Now, casting-wise it's worth noting, this came together in the end really very quickly. So we're in 2000 at this point when these conversations are taking place. And Swordfish would ultimately be released in the middle of 2001. So there was the small matter of casting, and Joel Silver had targeted, then at the peak of his second wave, possibly third if you count Look Who's Talking, wave of box office power, John Travolta. And Travolta, off the back of Pulp Fiction, had appeared in a run of successful movies, including the likes of Phenomenon, Get Shorty, and he had actually turned down the script for Swordfish 5 or 6 times. But with Dominic Senna attached, the two had a meeting, and Senna pitched his version of how he wanted the film to be. And at this point, it was a little bit make or break for the project, because if they couldn't lure Travolta in, Senna wasn't that massively inclined to do it without him, although how much of that is the standard Hollywood interview, they were the only choice, etc., etc. But nonetheless, it was clear that getting a yes off Travolta would be the thing that got this off the starting grid. And they got a yes off Travolta. He liked what Dominic Senna had said about the movie, and he was in. But who would co-star with him? Glad you asked. So the casting director of the film recommended an upcoming actor at that point by the name of Hugh Jackman. Now this, whilst at this point John Travolta was a big movie star, Hugh Jackman was not. That he'd done some smaller Aussie films. He'd done he'd obviously done work in theatre, but in the summer of 2000, X-Men had hit big. But it was still an unknown, really how much box office pulling power Hugh Jackman had. The X-Men notably wasn't a film that went into cinemas with movie star names above the title, and thus, whilst Hugh Jackman had obviously got a surge of popularity off the back of it, could he open a movie? That was still a question. It didn't help either that Senna wasn't massively bowled over by X-Men, but instead, when Jackman's name came up, he sought out some of Jackman's earlier independent films that he'd made in Australia. Now, at this point, names that were being bandied around to co-star opposite John Travolta in Swordfish were the usual suspects at that point, the likes of John Cusack. Val Kilmer's name was dropped in, and so Jackman was something of a wild card. But that was what ultimately appealed to Dominic Senna, that he, in much the same way that he saw the script and didn't quite know how it was going to pan out as he was reading it, he couldn't really put his finger on how Hugh Jackman would play the role. He didn't sense that it was going to be entirely predictable. And so there was the pivotal moment in the casting of Jackman. Well, that was a meeting that took place in the summer of 2000, that Senna and Jackman just had a small meeting actually at Los Angeles airport as Jackman was flying off to do another film, and Senna presented to Jackman the screenplay and chatted about the project. Jackman read it on the flight, and the thing that attracted Jackman to the film was the same that had attracted John Travolta to the film, really. The boldness of the opening monologue that I played a bit of to you right at the start of this podcast. That was ultimately what turned John Travolta onto the film. He just thought that opening monologue was spectacular and really wanted to do that. In fact, when it came to filming that monologue. Senna would appreciate the difference of opening a film like that, which is why it's pretty much shot in a dark environment with the focus purely on Travolta. There's a little bit of playing with lenses, etc., etc. But Jackman liked that as well, and he was reading the script on the plane, and he decided to do it after reading that opening monologue in the first few pages. Joel Silver had a way-in already to Halle Berry, and so she also signed up for the movie. And all of a sudden, this movie was moving forward. It was a go project, and it was moving forward at speed. That it was only in August of 2000 that news actually broke that Hugh Jackman was in talks to take that co-starring role, and the filming on the movie would begin. Well, we've gone from August of 2000. Filming would begin in September 2000, just to give you a flavour of how quickly this was coming together. That Gone in 60 Seconds had only come out in the previous June, but this particular project was motoring. There was still little bits of casting just to tie up. So San Shepard comes in to play a senator in the movie, and Senna admitted he'd considered Nick Nolte for that particular role. Travolta also needed to get on to filming his subsequent movie, Domestic Disturbance, which he was going to do after Swordfish. So there was a little bit of against the clock about it. But the movie would require an awful lot of preparation for particularly complicated sequences that we're coming to now. But it's worth noting that this was a very practical film, and a very tricky practical film to put together. It would cost $102 million to make, ultimately. So it wasn't cheap either, but neither was it at the high end of expensive, as cinema was gradually edging towards at that point. But given the practical demands of much of the action within it, for it to get up and running quite so quickly was no small feat. So Senna, going back to that director's commentary, he he's very, very open about the highs and lows of the film. He talks often in that commentary about moments in the screenplay that they came to shoot that he just wasn't particularly satisfied or happy with, and they reworked a little bit on the day and were changing things during film. Now, that in itself is not uncommon. That if you go back to the podcast I did on Sense and Sensibility, for instance, Emma Thompson would each night take the screenplay back home to her hotel room and continue to rework the screenplay. In the case of Swordfish, though, there were one or two scenes that they came up with pretty much on the day, which for a film of such a big logistical taxing challenge isn't probably the best way to do it. So, going back to that opening scene, there's some quite interesting choices in there. That it starts at black, you get a couple of minutes of Travolta talking, and at that point, what's interesting about that opening scene as well, and it's one of the many interesting creative decisions Senna made throughout the making of this film, is there's no coverage of other actors in there, and he chose not to shoot any coverage of other actors. He knew from the start that he wanted to open with this arresting opening monologue. And crucially, he had the backing of Joel Silver on this one. Now, Silver was, of course, he had the power with Warner Brothers, but also he hadn't worked with Dominic Senna before. Senna had an extensive background in commercials before he came to make Gone in 60 Seconds. But nonetheless, there was, as is reported in the commentary track, a growing confidence from the producer in his director as the film continued shooting, that the daily footage that was coming back was much to the satisfaction of Silver, and he was convinced that they had something there. The second big sequence in the film is also worth just zeroing in on for a minute, because it does open with a bank heist, and it's a mild spoiler, but it opens with a massive explosion. And this is where Senna's commercial background really came to play. I remember reading an interview with the late, great Tony Scott once upon a time. I think it was when he was building up to making Spy Game, and he talked about how he was using techniques that he'd taken on commercials just so so he could practice and see if they would work. And Tony Scott obviously had an extensive resume of commercial work as well, but he was using that as a sandbox as well for techniques that he could use in his film. Senna did pretty much the same thing, in that he brought a lot of the very stylistic approaches that he would bring to his commercials to the film. And so the explosion you get at the opening of the movie, well, what the director wanted to do here was use a technique that he perfected in commercials of experiencing 1 or 2 seconds of an explosion in slow motion, but swirling round at the same time to see the impact on everyone and everything. And it's a really good shot. I know it's really easy to punch down on films like Swordfish, and Lord, there are problems, but there's there's 2 very stylistic choices up front, where he had the protective cloak of Joel Silver, that he was able to do those and get them in the way that they wanted. I would argue that the film doesn't then live up to those 2 opening sequences, but crikey, at least it had them in the first place. There are, of course, other sequences in the movie that are worth discussing. Let's talk about the bit where there's a bit in the movie, and again, I'm not spoiling anything particularly here. The intro scene where we get with Hugh Jackman, he's in the middle of nowhere and he's hitting golf balls, and this is one of those scenes that Senna was talking about, where the screenplay was trimmed down pretty much as they did it. That this intro scene where Halle Berry's character Ginger Knowles comes in to recruit Hugh Jackman's hacker Stanley Jobson was originally written as 3 pages with lots of flirting between the 2 of them. They had the problem that Halle Berry at one point had to hit a golf shot, and she'd never really played golf until the morning of the shoot and had to have a quick bit of training just to get one shot of her taking one shot. They cut this dialogue right down. So there's several times in the commentary Senna talks about, well, that would be a bit dull if we'd have done it that way. And this was one of the things they really wanted to economise some of the dialogue and just cut down some of the stuff that they just didn't think would work. With that in mind, it's kind of amazing 1 or 2 of the bits that did actually get through. There is an infamous scene in the movie. Let me tenderly take you through this one, chums, where Hugh Jackman, against the clock, I think he's had tequila by this point as well. He's asked to do an impossible hack with John Travolta watching him whilst his, let's just go with his nether regions were being attended to by someone else in the scene. And I remember watching that scene where the first time it was when I saw the film for the first time, it was just like, hang on, that's a bit, isn't it? And there was a lot of discussion about that scene afterwards, and as it turned out, there was discussion whether they should do it that way in the first place at all. And what Senna's argument was here was they did plot out a version of that scene where Hugh Jackman's adamantium is not being attended to, but without the attention that's been paid to his grundies, that the scene played dull, that it took some of the tension out of it. Now, how much you buy that, I don't know. I mean, basically, this scene isn't working. Hollywood calls for a blowjob. Isn't the greatest of looks, really. And there was a television version of it that had to be shot that was a lot less explicit than, I mean, it's hardly ragingly explicit, but it was a lot less explicit than the version we see in the film. Nonetheless, that sequence got in, as did several others that pushed plausibility a little bit. So Senna admitted early in the project, and he admits to us watching the film, that he doesn't know an awful lot about computers. And there are various sequences in the film that do lead you to think that the people who made the film do not know an awful lot about computers. But this was Hollywood at work, because Swordfish, of course, it's a big Hollywood production. It had a technical consultant on board the film who was on set every day or two, giving them very precise technical advice as to how things would work, and would talk them through the mechanics of computer hacking, how this would work and how this would work. With that information at hand, Senna pushed back against it, and I don't think this is unreasonable. I might be shot for this, I don't know. But he argued that if you present computer hacking as is in the middle of a Hollywood blockbuster, it's going to look a bit dull. That it's just going to be a screen and that's it. And so they came back with this idea for a three-dimensional worm, a hydra, and a hydra with multiple heads and stuff like that. And they knew, even as they were shooting it, that it was nonsense. They knew that this was not how computer hacking worked. But conversely, they knew they had to make it a bit more dramatic than just someone just sat there smacking a few keys and doing a hack in the way that, let's just say, wouldn't be particularly Hollywoodized. I've just made the word Hollywoodized, and do you know what? For this, I'm just going to stick with it. So they knew every criticism you've got of how computing is represented in Swordfish. They knew. If you want a bit of bonus pub trivia, it won't win you a pub quiz because no one will ask the question. All the scenes where you see actors with computer screens in the background, etc., they had no idea what they were looking at. When they were actually filming, all the screens were blank. They were all put on in post-production. There wasn't. That's not to say that this is a heavily CG film or anything like that. It's just little bits and bobs like that were easy enough to add afterwards. There's also a very contentious scene, which I think particularly now, I mean, it stuck out like a sore thumb then. It sticks out doubly so now, where Halle Berry is 1 minute wearing a bathing suit and 1 minute she's not wearing a bathing suit, and there's no I was just trying to coat it with there's no obvious reason. There's no reason at all why she should take it off at the point in the sequence. And again, they knew what they were doing. There was these were deliberate choices. There were stories around the time that Berry had pocketed a six-figure sum for disrobing in that scene, which were also, this is less reported, denied at the time. But it was, Joel Silver gave an interview where he said that it was Halle Berry's, quote, sophisticated on-screen image that convinced him she ought to tackle a sensual role. And he said, quote, I've known Halle for years and I felt this was the time for her to do this. He says, of the actress's first topless scene. I think it's cool for the character and good for the box office. And there you go. That's your motivation for why that particular scene happened. There was a version of it shot where Berry kept her clothes on. That was not the one that was used. Also in the cast for this one, Sam Shepard. I think this is a lovely story. And Sam Shepard lived on a farm. Well, I don't know if he lives there now. We're not best mates. We didn't fall out. We just never knew each other. Sam Shepard lives on a farm in Minnesota, or certainly did at the time. And also, he didn't fly. He would drive everywhere in his 4x4. And so the first actual shot of Swordfish that was in the can was shot with Sam Shepard and John Travolta fishing in Oregon. And basically, it took Shepard 4 days to drive there to do that shoot. And then his next scene was in Los Angeles, and he had to do another 800-mile drive. So they had to delay in the schedule when he could shoot those scenes because he had to drive there, and they didn't know where he was. They just had to hope he would turn up on time, which he did. On day one of shooting in Oregon, John Travolta was there, but he showed up actually with an allergic reaction. He had a bump on his lip. So if you want nerdy trivia that will never win you a pub quiz, the close-ups in the scenes at the start that you see of Travolta were actually shot geographically completely somewhere else 3 months later because they couldn't do the close-ups at that point, and they just had to get some plywood, put some grass on it, and just put a kind of desert background together. Most of the film, though, would ultimately be shot in and around the Los Angeles area, and there was a lot of night shooting. They used at one point, actually, a car by the name of a TVR. I don't know an awful lot about cars, but I do know at this point that car wasn't available in America, so they had to import it for the film, and they only had a right-hand drive version of the car, whereas cars in America are left-hand drive. So don't go looking too closely at the car in particular sequences of the film, because they couldn't go incredibly close up for that reason. It was imported especially for the production, and Travolta and Jackman had to spend quite a lot of time working with stunt coordinators to do the driving scenes themselves. They are clearly visible in those scenes as well, and they needed to do them. Perhaps the most infamous scene towards the end of the movie was also one of the most taxing. Again, this is a mild spoiler, so I'll just da-di-da just for a minute in case you want to fast forward 5 minutes. Da-di-da, I've done that. And this was a sequence towards the end of the movie where basically a bus is flying through Los Angeles. It's lifted up by a helicopter and flies across one of the busiest cities on Earth. And this was an idea that was put to Joel Silver, and Joel Silver loved the idea and got the resources together and also got the required permits together to do this incredible sequence towards the end of the film. And it was basically a helicopter carrying a £15,000 bus. Took a lot of pre-visualization work, and the preparation of it was clearly insane. But to the point where there were other end sequences that were on standby if they couldn't actually get this one over the line. And what's surprising about it is how much of that bus lift is done practically. So there's a couple of little bits that are CG in the scene. So at one point it smashes through a sign, and it's not the bus that's CG in that, it's the sign. There's a cable snap in there, that's CG. But the bus is the bus. You are indeed seeing it, and there's a bit where it comes into land and smashes a building up. That was a set that was built outside of Los Angeles, outside of central Los Angeles, so that they could do that bit. Obviously, that wasn't practical to do in the middle of a crowded city, but they put that set together, and as you would expect, they had one chance to get it, and of course, in the end, they did. The film wrapped production on the 15th of December 2000, so there was still 6-7 months to do the post-production work, and there was quite a lot of post-production work in there. But what there wasn't was a massive budget for huge amounts of special effects, and apparently in the end they used something like 20-25 different special effects, visual effects houses, all doing little bits here and there just because of the tightness of the budget. There was still some disagreement over the ending for the movie, that on the disc release, again, I won't go into detail just for fear of spoiling it, there are 2 alternative endings in there, and there was some toing and froing over just which way practically to take the film. But the movie would ultimately be lined up for release in the summer of 2001. It was released in the US on June the 8th, 2001. Much of the press at that point was about the sequence with Halle Berry removing her bathing suit. The reviews, though, that they would not be massively kind. They would be middling at best, but generally quite critical. But nonetheless, the film opened to 18 million of business on its opening weekend, on its way to nearly 70 million of box office in the US. Did pretty much that again overseas for a worldwide take of $147 million. It would open at number 1 in America. It would knock Shrek off the top of the box office. It would knock Pearl Harbor off the top of the box office as well. I really should come to that in a future film stories. The only other big opener against it that particular week was Evolution, which again is a film I've got quite a lot of time for as well. Swordfish, though, whenever it tends to be discussed now, I mean, there was hardly clamouring for a sequel for it. It's more to do with the fact that, let's just say, it doesn't provide the world's most realistic depiction of how computers work in Hollywood. And if you're ever looking for an example for a PowerPoint presentation or something like that of just how far off the mark it is in terms of realism, there you go. Swordfish is your film. Does it stand up? No, not massively, I don't think. I don't think it was great then. I don't think it's great now, but there's fun in it, certainly. And also, what surprised me about the whole thing was just how much really it was a little bit more of a guerrilla production with a U than I was initially expecting. Which brings me to the halfway point of the latest film stories. I've waffled too much, so I'm going to go through this bit quickly. If you can please subscribe to this podcast, it helps me enormously. Likewise, if you can leave, ideally, a very positive review for the podcast, that helps. I'm an independent publisher. Little things like that make the world a difference. If you want to support what I'm doing, I'm at patreon.com/Simon Brew. I also have a live show, if you want more film stories in person, that takes place every month in Birmingham in the UK. There are more dates coming around the country as well. You can get all the information at www.filmstories.co.uk. But I'm going to crack on now with the second of the 2 films. I really like this one. I really like this one. I'm going to play you a clip. We're going back to the 1990s. I'll pick up the story the other side of this.
Now she's part of his life.
He's in a coma.
Oh, I was going to marry him.
Who's she?
She's his fiance. No. Peter's engaged.
She saved his life.
Part of his family.
Hey, sis. Where's my, Lucy's going to marry my brother Peter. What? I didn't mean for this to happen. I don't know what to do.
Don't tell them a thing. Well, since they met you, they figure they have Peter back. They need you, Lucy. Just like you need them.
Come on, everybody. And the grandmother, she's got this heart thing.
She had 3 attacks already.
Now, you tell them now, and you might as well shoot Grandma.
Oh.
That's right. You haven't met Jack yet.
Welcome to the family.
Oh, thank you.
Well, there she goes. She's met Jack now. Jack is played by Bill Pullman, the character of Lucy by Sandra Bullock. The cast of this one also includes Peter Gallagher, Peter Ball, Jack Warden in there as well. And the film, of course, is 1995's delightful romantic comedy While You Were Sleeping, directed by John Turteltaub, written by Daniel G. Sullivan and Frederick LeBeau. And the movie, what I think, for my money, it's a really good rom-com. And also, I think Sandra Bullock's performance in the film is one of the best mainstream acting performances of the 90s, that she has a character who does really dislikable things in the film, and there's a really creepy element to the actual undercurrent plot of While You Were Sleeping, and yet Bullock still manages to put on screen a character really worth rooting for. And I understand too that that's part writers, part directors, that she can't take sole credit, but I've seen this kind of character before in films like Planes, Trains and Automobiles, for instance, and Identity Thief starring Melissa McCarthy. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, but I do think it takes a really particular actor to be able to pull that kind of role off. Now, While You Were Sleeping actually began with its 2 writers, Daniel G. Sullivan and Frederick LeBeau, as most films start with their writers, so nothing massively radical there. But they became friends at New York University when they were doing their studies, and they started writing bits and bobs and developing together, and ultimately they decided to move to Los Angeles. Sometimes they they did write apart, but they would pitch projects together, and they would ultimately join forces in the early 90s to develop a screenplay that was called Snowflakes, and it was a screenplay ultimately that they did a bit of development work on and lured some interest into, but it would ultimately end up going nowhere. But the pair had a conversation about dating, and they had another thought, and it's again, you can't shed the creepiness of it a little bit, but they pitched the idea of a man who in their eyes was a fish salesman who sees a Scandinavian woman, an attractive one, walk by, and the man thinks it's love at first sight. She then gets hit by a truck and is in a coma. And then the man, through circumstances, gives her family the impression that they're dating. And so they started working this into a story. They went with the working title of Coma Guys. And, well, yeah, it's not too tricky to raise a few sort of problems there. Because even in the 1990s, there was a kind of feeling that the opening was creepy, that the actual proposed film that they were putting together amounted basically to a man stalking a woman. And so it was when it was pitched, Frederick LeBeau did a fairly recent interview with BuzzFeed, and he did explain that they pitched the project to Meg Ryan's production company. If you were going to make a romantic comedy in the 90s, it made sense to pitch it to Meg Ryan's production company, to be fair, and they were hoping that Ryan herself would be interested in starring in the film. And it was Ryan's development executive who said to them, well, why would she want to do the film if she's in a coma for most of it? Which isn't a bad question, really. And secondly, the development executive pointed out, well, you're just being creepy. There's, the quote goes, it's kind of predatory with this guy telling this comatose woman's family that he's engaged to her. And the development executive at Meg Ryan's company said, why don't you flip it around? Let the woman be the one fabricating the story. Then it's no longer predatory, it's funny. And they realised they were right. So what the development executive was right. So what they held on to was the central idea in their thinking, which is a little bit more conventional. Is there such a thing as love at first sight? And they made the changes to the script. They worked it into a position where it could be sold, and it sold for a 6-figure sum. A 6-figure sum that landed it at Disney. And Disney, at this stage, well, it had a few ideas for who could take the leading role in the film. So Demi Moore was one of the first names to bubble up, and she was interested. She quite liked the idea of taking on the lead role in the film, and when Demi Moore was interested in the film, Disney was looking at that stage to pair her up with someone like Patrick Swayze in the lead role. There were also other combinations floated around at the time. Harrison Ford and Gina Davis was going to be one combination to lead the film. Ford would go off to do a sort of rom-com. He went to do the remake of Sabrina instead, but it was Demi Moore who had effectively first refusal on the film. And the problem was that Disney and Demi Moore couldn't agree, or Demi Moore's representatives couldn't agree on a contract for the film. Disney was notoriously really quite tight on paying movie stars in the early to mid 1990s. They would relax that position towards the end of the decade. But at this point, with Demi Moore, who was only a year or so away from her bumper 8-figure payday in Striptease, a deal could not be done. Other people who were interested in this, well, Nicole Kidman was at the start of her career, really, and so she was interested in playing the role of Lucy, but didn't get the job. The role of Jack, that would ultimately go to Bill Pullman. Well, Matthew McConaughey was one of those who auditioned for that, but again, this was pre-movie stardom. Matthew McConaughey, and ironically, who would end up starring, and his breakthrough role would be in A Time to Kill, the John Grisham adaptation, where he would star opposite Sandra Bullock. Russell Crowe was mentioned as a possible, but then Disney also had a further idea because it thought Julia Roberts might be interested in this one. And Disney and Julia Roberts, of course, had hit pay dirt with 1990's Pretty Woman. So if you want a lead for a romantic comedy, why not Julia Roberts? Well, it can't help that she was in the midst of a couple of difficult productions at the time. She was co-starring with Nick Nolte in the 1994 film I Love Trouble, and that was a notoriously difficult production. She would also star in the title role in Mary Riley for Stephen Frears, and that also turned into a notoriously difficult production. And ultimately, Julia Roberts decided to pass on the role of Lucy in the film that would become known as While You Were Sleeping. So Sandra Bullock was nowhere near the first choice here, but quietly her career had been bubbling up. So she'd made The Vanishing, she'd made Demolition Man, and in 1994, a film that I covered in a previous Film Stories podcast would be coming out by the name of Speed. You might have heard of it. Crucially, though, she'd also done a film called Love Potion Zero for a man called Roger Birnbaum, who was, at the time that film was made, a high up at 20th Century Fox, back when 20th Century Fox was a thing. But Birnbaum happened to be a producer on the film While You Were Sleeping, and he remembered Bullock in that movie, and she suddenly found herself in pretty much pole position. So it was Bullock who initiated the contact with the studio and said it's just the kind of thing she wanted to do, that she felt she could relate to the loneliness in the story, the importance of family in the story. And even though at the time she wasn't well known, and even after Speed, really, she wasn't a massive movie star instantly. She would go on actually to say that While You Were Sleeping was her breakout film, that it was the film that ultimately launched her career. And I think that's pretty much right. This was the film that lived or died on her name, really, and it was her name above the title. She would squeeze this one in and then go straight on to making The Net, which I've covered in a previous Film Stories podcast. So that whole little row of movies was packed together quite tightly for Sandra Bullock, at the point really that her career went into the stratosphere. So there was other casting that needed to be done here, of course. And so the romantic lead, co-lead in the film was the character of Jack, who would ultimately be played by Bill Pullman. And this was Bill Pullman, the pre-Independence Day. He wasn't yet President of the United States, and he didn't really have a lot of form as a lead in a Hollywood movie. And in fact, at this stage in his career, if anything, he tended to be, in romantic films at least, or in dramas, he was playing the man who was left behind, who was dumped or just... So, for instance, in the film A League of Their Own, covered that in a previous podcast as well, he was the character who's left behind by Gina Davis. In Sleepless in Seattle, he found his character, who was initially in a relationship with Meg Ryan, without going heavily into spoilery, not so much in a relationship with Meg Ryan by the end of the film. Somersby as well. I mean, a whole bunch of films where he was the man who was basically in the film to be dumped as much as anything else. But he really wanted the role of Jack, Peter's younger brother in the film. Peter being the man ultimately who ends up in the coma, who the character of Lucy, Peter's family thinks Lucy is his fiancée, etc, etc, etc. So Pullman went along for the audition, and here's where a stroke of luck kicked in, because in the audition room he bumped into Sandra Bullock, and the pair bonded really quickly. And that when they went in for their audition, I believe in modern youth parlance we might say that they smashed it, that they had an instant chemistry that really came across, that impressed the team behind the movie, and they found themselves cast in the film. Now, in terms of who was going to direct the film, well, I gave it away, really. It's a man called John Turteltaub, who at this stage had a run of films for Disney. He'd made Three Ninjas, cunningly retitled Three Ninja Kids in the UK. Then, again, I've covered this one in a previous... I've done quite a lot of episodes, you know. I've covered this in a previous film stories. He did a film called Cool Runnings, and that had really been a hit out of nowhere. So Disney quite liked working with John Turteltaub. The actors liked working with him, that he delivered relatively low-cost films that made a fair amount of profit. And so when he was on the lookout for a new project, here was While You Were Sleeping. It was a go project at Disney. There was a $17 million budget attached to it, and he duly signed up to make the film. Now, there were a few challenges, though, because filming on this one wouldn't ultimately begin until October 1994. So, I mean, just to reiterate at this point, Bullock wasn't... Speed had come out in America by that point, hadn't come out in the UK until the end of September, I think. But she'd signed on the dotted line when no one was really quite sure just whether she could carry a film as a movie star. So... at the point that While You Were Sleeping was greenlit and was heading into production, there was another competing movie that was said to be, well, treading, let's just say, similar ground. And it got to a point where this ended up in court. So in August 1994, TriStar, a company owned by Sony, went to court arguing that there were similarities between a film that it was working on called Mrs. Winterbourne, that at that time it was trying to lure Ricky Lake into starring in, and ultimately it would be successful in luring Lake to the project. But there was an argument from TriStar that the similarities were too close. And so TriStar filed suit in a Los Angeles court, arguing that While You Were Sleeping should be delayed until Mrs. Winterbourne was released in cinemas. Now, this suit was fairly quickly thrown out, as it would happen, and Mrs. Winterbourne would follow the year after. While You Were Sleeping would make it into cinemas first. Filming, well, one of the things also it's worth noting is that Disney, putting up the budget, it decided it had a better shot at selling the movie if it turned it into one set in and around Christmas, which is where While You Were Sleeping hits something of a Die Hard 2 problem. Guess what? I've done Die Hard 2 in a previous Film Stories episode. I've got to stop doing that. So, filming began in October 1994 in Chicago, and it was quite a location-heavy film, really. But there were sequences that required snow, and there was not snow. And so, a la Die Hard 2, artificial snow had to be brought in for certain sequences in the movie. That said, the first 4 weeks on the film were spent primarily on location in Chicago, including 5 consecutive weekends of filming at local railway stations. So this is given away very early in the film. I don't think I'm spoiling this for anyone. There is an accident at a railway station which ultimately sets up the key drama of the film, that this character is in a coma. In order to film that, the producers and the director, they needed a section of rail with no live current going through it, because it would be bad if an actor went onto a live railway track. They would not come out of that very well. So what they needed was just a small section of track that was not electrified, which they found at I think it was 2 different local stations. But then the train that went along the track, well, that still required some electricity to move. And so there was a little bit of a logistical effort here in making sure that the train had enough oomph in it, really, that it would keep moving once it went from the electrified section of the track to the non-electrified section of the track. Who knew that this podcast would turn into a forensic dissection of how the railway system works in Chicago? But there you go. So they needed the train to have enough momentum, but also enough, they didn't want it to rocket and not give the actor the chance to get out of the way. So all these little small logistical problems that they had to solve on location. They did also secure a house for key family scenes in and around the Chicago area, and they did rent, basically they rented a house in the area and did the filming in that. The one exception where they did build a set and they needed the control was the hospital sequences in the film. That they realised that the hospital sequences in the movie were going to take about 3 weeks of filming, and so the decision was made that they were going to build a set in a studio for that, because it wasn't logistically possible really to rent out a bit of a hospital, and also they needed full control of that set. So, if someone had the temerity to actually be injured or require medical attention on a movie set, this would be less of a problem. In an actual hospital, they would otherwise have had to shut off their cameras. All perfectly understandable. So they built that set, and quite a sizable one by the sounds of it. There were interesting choices in terms of clothing. I can't honestly say I'm an expert on costume and clothing, but it's worth looking at just how restrained the wardrobe is for Bullock's character in this. Lots of long jumpers, lots of practical outfits. I mean, it's cold, and she's, she's a lonely, unhappy character, and they don't get that across in a demonstrative way. There's just lots of little subtle touches here and there, which I personally think was a better way to do it. Now, Turtletop as a director he wasn't absolutely slavish to the screenplay. I mean, by most accounts I read of him, he's very much an actor's director. He allows degrees of improvisation. He likes his cast to spar, and he's willing to try stuff. He's willing to go out on a limb and just come up with an idea and just go with it. That said, he does also film the script as well. But basically, the aftermath of While You Were Sleeping, even the interviews that come out in hindsight, was pretty much everyone on the film seemed to have a really, really happy time on this particular movie. And Turtletop himself would say, I mean, he's gone on to do most recently The Meg, actually, but he's talked about it's one of his favourite films to make, and he'd love to do another romantic comedy such that he enjoyed doing While You Were Sleeping. The film ultimately wrapped up filming on December the 14th of 1994. So, I mean, this was a fairly contained shoot, 2.5 months in and around the Chicago area. What's more, it wasn't a movie that was going to require an awful lot of post-production time. There wasn't a need to put a Nick Fury post-credit sequence in there. There wasn't a lot of special effects. And so the movie was ready for an April the 21st, 1995 release in the US, which not quite high season. It's worth putting into context that April 1995 was generally regarded as pre-blockbuster season. At the point it was released, Bad Boys was in its 3rd week of release and had been an out-of-blockbuster season hit. But to give you a flavour of the other films that were around at that point, Rob Roy was in there. Kiss of Death opened the same weekend. Also, holdovers included Muriel's Wedding. Don Juan DeMarco, that's a film not many people talk about, well worth seeking out. Likewise, Circle of Friends. Likewise, Outbreak was still milling around the chart. I will come to that at some point in a future Film Stories podcast. While You Were Sleeping opened to really good reviews, but also it proved there and then that Sandra Bullock was a new movie star. It opened to $9.2 million worth of business in the US alone, on its way to an $81 million gross, and that was a real achievement at that point out of blockbuster season. That it would also crucially add another $100 million overseas for a worldwide take of $182 million. And While While You Were Sleeping was and is a really notable hit for the mid-90s. There was, in fact, also it's worth noting that it wasn't just a commercial hit. That Bullock would, by the end of the year, have a Golden Globe nomination for her performance in the film and would be well into making the net as well. Now, there was a brief chatter that surfaced about writing a sequel to the film, and the writers did talk about this. They said at the time, they immediately said, we have to come up with a follow-up. And the writers pushed back. They said, we said there's nowhere to go. And one of the studio people said, if we come up with a good angle for a sequel, that he'd buy the writers a car. And so they kind of reconciled. They could have written a daft sequel at that point and taken the car, but they just didn't think it was worth one. And ultimately, they dropped out of the project, and Disney elected not to pick it up with other writers either. And While You Were Sleeping would exist as a standalone movie. Notably, too, its two writers, Daniel G. Sullivan and Frederick LeBeau, this was their only produced screenplay, but they did get quite a lot of writing work around that time, enough to comfortably make a living, and they both reported that they're well paid for it, and both have kind of taken a step back really from the industry since. But if you're only going to write one film, I don't think While You Were Sleeping is a bad one to write at all. I do think this really is a standout rom-com from the 90s. I don't think it's the best. My favourite of the 90s is Tin Cup. That will be addressed in a future Film Stories podcast. But While You Were Sleeping was a film that proved Bill Pullman could be a romantic lead, Sandra Bullock was a movie star, and also there was a point where there was a room for a rom-com like this on a high concept to take a really inherently creepy concept and actually turn it into a film that worked. Which all brings us to the end of this latest Film Stories podcast. Again, I've gone on too long. I will do this bit really quick. You can find more from me on Twitter at Simon Brew. I am live in Birmingham over the next 2-3 months. If you go to the Film Stories website, filmstories.co.uk, look up the live events there. You'll see where and when I'm going to be. It'd be lovely to see some of you there. You can find us on Facebook, facebook.com/filmstoriesonline. You can buy the latest issues of Film Stories and Film Stories Junior magazines at the aforementioned website, and there's a whole host of video exclusive film stories at youtube.com/filmstories. For now, thank you so much as always for your support. Thank you for listening to me waffling on. I'm going to go off and watch another load of films just so I can come back in a week's time with another episode of Film Stories. You all take care. Bye bye.